Hi, I'm SJ.
And I'm Pegsy. Welcome to our Heels in the Hierarchy podcast, where we discuss the experiences and challenges faced by working women today. Join us as we explore a range of topics from navigating career advancement to balancing work and personal life. So step into an episode of Heels in the Hierarchy, the place where we explore current challenges and opportunities and share extraordinary insights for ordinary women, one conversation at a time.
Hi. So today we're talking about self-care and the importance of self-care. And actually part of what we do talk about quite a lot, isn't it, is the workplace and being leader. And often the topic that is quite close to my heart is around the importance of self-care. And so hopefully we can get better tips and trips of what self-care is, maybe bust the myths of the difference between well-being and self-care, and having a conversation around what's our responsibility as leaders and helping people to think about the impact that self-care can have in their lives.
So that's a good starting place, actually. What is the difference between self-care and well-being? For me, with my sort of HR hat on, as we HR people love to say, I see self-care and well-being as kind of interchangeable in management language and how we talk to managers about well-being and themselves and their teams and that sort of thing. Is there a difference between well-being and self-care?
Yeah, if you think about it, how the landscape of even what well-being has been looked at in the workplace and how we used to work, if you think of it as well-being is wider than self-care in terms of the self. You're thinking about, holistically, when we're talking about well-being, we're talking about your social elements, that's your financial, your things that interact with you. Whereas when we're talking about self-care, it's very specific around choice and behaviours and thinking about the elements of choice that we have to take care of ourselves. So when we think about well-being, it often can be a lot broader. So self-care is part of well-being, but in itself, it's an active choice and a behaviour that we can take on. Whereas well-being is wider than ourselves. So it can be impacted by the environmental factors. It can be impacted by your financial. It can be impacted about all the holistic elements. So although it can be seen as entwined, it's actually very specific as something that we can do as a daily act to take care of ourselves, to notice our own self, to think about noticing who we are, what is happening around us, and more of a self-awareness act and choice of behaviours than it is about everything else, if that makes sense.
So basically what you're saying is that self-care is more about taking care of ourselves, but not only in a workplace context, but all of the elements around ourselves as individuals that could influence how we take care. Does that make sense? That's very convoluted, isn't it?
That's quite interesting. But I think if we go back to even the simple thing of when we go flying, everyone goes, put your gas mask on first. The reason they do that is because actually you're no use to anybody if you're taking that off to help somebody else and you pass out and you're the responsible adult. So if we're thinking about that in whether it's in your workplace and you're leading, but you actually are so bad at time management and keeping people to time or tasks and things because you're spiraling out of control, you're not looking after yourself, then you're no good to your team and your team then perform. And if we think back at the cost of, for example, stress on the workplace and how many people take time off work for stress, although we don't necessarily have enough understanding of what stress looks like, stress is always going to be different and individual to that person. But actually, the research has shown that actually taking steps towards better self-care does improve your stress, reduces your stress levels, reduces your ability to have a negative mental health impact because you are in tune to what you need and you're being more aware of going, right, I need to take time out. I need to be taking my breaks. I need to be taking more breaths, and all these simple practices that we have in my perspective, society have kind of made us well-being and self-care being like something that we need to spend money on rather than an act of care to ourselves and love to ourselves and practicing daily practices that you can then attune into yourself. There's a big difference. I think there's a language issue, there's a perception issue, and there's the reality. So, self-care is not new. Wellbeing is not new. But the way then, in terms of whether it's having an impact, people are still going off on the work stress. People are still having daily pressures. People are still working longer hours because we've got accessibility to be able to do that. So we still have a circle of influence and control that we can go. Self-care still has a massive place in our daily lives, but in our workplaces as well. And we need to be able to feel that we're empowering others to take the ownership of their own self-care.
So with my HR hat on again, putting it just at a jaunty angle here, am I right then thinking about self-care almost as being a professional competency? In the HR and leadership and management development fields, we often have competencies that make up good leadership. What does a good leader look like? Here are the top 10 competencies, and they'll be about communication and team management and those sorts of things. But from what you're saying, I'm taking from that there's a really strong personal and professional competency that you can add to your leadership competency list, which goes back to what you were saying about putting your own gas mask on first. How can anyone follow you as a leader if you're not actually in the best possible place? And you're saying that self-care is very much a sort of core part of being a good leader.
Oh, 100%. I think I think, even if we started back at school, like school being talking about life skills and self-care and as an individual. And I think in the workplace, it has a huge percentage. I mean, I've gone in and taught all around the impacts around self-care, about what self-care is and isn't, and how sometimes we've glamorized it in terms of self-care being some around spa days, having your hair done. And that has been profitable for some in terms of, we can justify it if we're having a day out with the girls, or we're going to do it. We're going to have I'm desperate, I need some self-care. And similarly, if we're just going on a healthy plan and we're going, right, we're going to eat well, we're going to do all these things, and isn't that good? But actually someone else is benefiting, and but that doesn't last long. We're not very good at staying the course, but we'll spend money on spa days and different things, and we call that self-care. Whereas actually what I want to be able to start shifting the thinking is that self-care is everyday small practices. So it's really about educating people about, especially in the workplace, because it benefits them financially as a company. If they can think about, well, actually, if we are educating our teams and our staff to think practically, I mean, people are motivated by different things, right? So some, businesses are motivated by having the most productivity of staff and being able to make more money. But if you think about that, this average stats 50% because stress related, and 35% then has a negative impact on their mental health, which then impacts their productivity. That has a huge financial cost for that company. So by not putting in steps of going, think about what works for you, what is self-care for you, let's explore this topic. Let's think about the impact that has. If you're not motivated at work, if you're not feeling productive, if you're feeling stagnated, that's going to have an impact on your performance. That's going to impact the way that you are able, or even then work harder to try and compensate for that, rather than actually, if you're putting the daily practices of going, no, I need to be putting boundaries in place. I need to take myself away for half an hour and actually have the break that you're not being paid for. But we always stayed to work that because, when are we going to get the time to make up that work? That all has a knock-on effect. And then we go off on stress, on burnout. But actually, if we had the actual practice in a workplace and in our personal lives of daily practices, we would never be able to get to that point.
It's about our personal needs.
Yeah.
So listening to ourselves, we talk about listening to your body when you're exercising, for example, and making sure that you don't, overextend an arm if you're doing downward dog or something on yoga. But you're saying about being mindful of what our personal needs are in response to our personal circumstances and triggers.
But if you think about even that research shows that self-care in its own, because, people can talk about self-care as being anything. Right. So something that I'm quite passionate about, helping people, which what I call the 3 Ps of self-care.
Okay.
Which is perseverance, practice, and I've forgotten my own 3 Ps. Practice, prioritize, practice, persevere. I think I've written it down. 1 second. This is how my brain is. It's going, what is my 3 Ps? I write about it all the time. Oh yeah, practice, prioritize, and persevere. That's it. Right. So so one of the things that I would say is when we're thinking about self-care, it has to be personal. So, some people reading a book, of course it's self-care because they're taking time out and it's nurturing yourself. And you're kind of doing something that is going to be nurturing for you. And this is when I think it can be quite difficult because we are having to be very honest about, what is nurturing for us in a world that is overwhelmingly stimulated. And for somebody who is dyslexic, I don't think I've realised it probably in the last year or two how overstimulated I can be when I leave work, or because the amount of conversations, the amount of meetings, the amount of pressure, I leave feeling like almost spinning out sometimes because it's the fast pacedness, and self-care for me is a way of really slowing that down, slowing those voices, slowing that sense of being out of control, but I've got the next task to do. And then before I know it, I recognize that my stress levels go up because I'm talking faster. I'm not really being present in the moment. I'm not able to really give fully my attention. And the impact of that is then I'm not performing well because I'm not actually being the present leader or the person that I can be at home, or I can't really give someone attention because I haven't self-cared that day. Right? I'm not noticing that I'm getting that far. And that increases my stress levels, which then increases my behaviour, which then that impacts my performance.
So it's almost like it can be a sort of like a negative circle to get yourself into, can't it?
Yeah. And
without taking that time out.
But that's why it's so difficult, I think, is because it's the discipline of it. Is that we understand self-care at times as something that is self-indulgent or something that we deserve or something that we've paid for, rather than an essential life skill that you talked before about taught that can impact your daily interactions. So, when we're thinking about self-care and we're thinking about the cost of not doing it, we can see the benefits of exercise and being outdoors. There's so much more research around that, which of course is a form of self-care, but obviously it's so different. And when we're thinking about it and we're thinking, what are we going to do to be able to understand what that even looks like for us, is, is a little thing that I say called 3 Ps. And that would be around, you have to prioritize it. Because if you don't prioritize it, has a negative impact on your mood, your performance, your interactions with others. But you also have to persevere, because actually self-care can look different on different days. So it's a bit like if you've got one thing that you do, sometimes you're too heightened in your stress levels to do that. So it's a bit like saying to someone who's really pissed off, don't be pissed off. Or say, don't be angry.
Calm down. Calm down.
It's like the worst thing you can say, because that person's not cognitively present. Their nervous system is so heightened, their stress levels are so high that what they need is to just be able to, you give them the space to regulate themselves. So when you're asking somebody to do, that's what they can't. You need to be in an understanding. What do you need in that moment? So that whole practice and perseverance, it's about finding things that work in different situations. So, if I'm talking fast, I'll go and say, right, somebody, if I'm going to go for a walk, and you start walking fast because that's the pace that I'm at and that's where my mind's at.
Right.
And I'll keep going until I'm realising, okay, now I can breathe, and I need to, then I come down, I go, right, I need to start breathing a little bit more, and my voice will start changing, because actually then I've got all that nervous energy out.
Yeah.
But there's no point me going straight back into that environment. I just need to keep going until I've noticed and I've come down and I can actually be fully present again. So, but that's not always going to work. So I have to think about other things. Because if you only have one technique, it's like you've got a skill box with one spanner.
Yeah.
But then you go to a job and you don't need a spanner. You need a hammer.
Yeah.
You know?
Okay.
So you've got to have a toolbox, and that's where the practice and perseverance is, because it's like a skill that you've got to be able to switch on when you need it. So you need to prioritize yourself. You need to practice what works, and then you need to persevere.
Right.
And persevere is a harder one to do.
Yeah.
Because if you're trying to do anything, like I've been trying to start a new language for probably about the last 2 years.
Right.
Probably less than that, but it feels like it's 2 years because I start well and then life gets in the way.
Yeah.
And then I haven't really persevered with it. And then I'm frustrated because I can't speak the language. But of course I can't speak the language because I haven't put the practice in.
Yeah.
And I haven't prioritized that in my life. So therefore, I'm not going to get any better at it.
Well, that's interesting that you actually use language as an example, because I remember reading something, and it could well have been about self-care actually, but the example was that you don't go to evening classes to learn a new language and attend the first lesson and expect to be a fluent French speaker at the end of it. So you give yourself permission to struggle with the learning process, to have to put in the practice and all the rest of it. And yet it's almost, I think, with self-care in particular, that we kind of go, okay, I've done 5 minutes worth of meditation. I'm fixed now.
Or I should be feeling better.
Yeah.
But also what I've noticed in experience is, as life has got more complex, shall we say, that you have to create the right environment. And this is where sometimes the danger of going, you've got a spa day, or I'm just going to go for meditation for 5 minutes, is actually you need to find things in your daily life outside of those things. So that's why journaling's great. Why talking to a friend over the phone is great in your workplace. Why going for a walk with a colleague to talk about something else, about going to have your lunches away from your desk, being in nature, processing your thoughts, practicing breathing techniques. So when you do get to the meditation, you've got some basics in there to be able to go, right, I'm able to do this. But if you're waiting till you're stressed to practice self-care, you've missed the point.
Yeah.
You know, you've got to practice, and you've got to really persevere yourself of going, I need to find what works for me and in what is helpful. And self-care can be saying, taking yourself and working in a different room. Self-care can be, I'll do that, right, but I'm going to just do that then. Self-care is going to go into a different room and a different kitchen to go and make a drink and take a minute to breathe.
Or a different floor, yeah.
And the daily practice of recognising the reason why you're doing that is to take time to care for yourself and your mental state. All those little things which you don't see as little things all add up.
So it's not selfish to self-care. It's actually quite a good leadership quality.
I think if you think about it, it goes, you know, sometimes in the healthcare, you know, it's always, sometimes I've seen it, heard it so many times, oh, you know, you're doing self-care, it's all the fluffy stuff.
Yeah.
But actually, if you think about that negative language that you're putting on it, as if it's a bad thing to be talking about and practicing, and yet the stats for going off stress hasn't changed.
Yeah.
Because it's been, you know, there's still, stress isn't everywhere, but people would rather say they're going off for stress than they would about mental health or I burnt out.
Yeah.
Right? And so that's something for me, is it's actually, it all starts with self-care. And actually, because research has demonstrated that it reduces the stress levels, it reduces you going off on work sick and mental health related illnesses, because you're practicing that, whether that's journal writing, whether that's writing your thoughts out, whether that's having a conversation. That's why it's the perseverance and practice, but actually finding what works, you have to have a skill box. And if you don't have a toolbox of things that you can use, you're going in blind, and that's the danger.
It made me think as well that there is a lot of pressure in the workplace for both genders, but there's a lot of pressure in the workplace to kind of like belong and go along with the perceived organisational culture. At the moment, a lot of that, as much as we talk about well-being in general, and as you say, self-care specifically, that the badge of honour is about, I've been in back-to-back meetings and I was working until 10 o'clock last night, and the expectation that I've put on people to sort of do a full day's work, put their kids to bed, and then log on again in the evening. Actually, what you're saying is that's counterproductive, and you can achieve probably more by taking out almost like micro moments in self, to focus on self-care.
Yeah. I mean, I remember a workplace that I worked and having to have so many interesting conversations with the resistance of inviting people to have lunch.
Right.
And inviting people to go, actually, my lunch is I'll go for a walk around the block first, and then I'll sit down and eat, and then we'll have a conversation. And they're like, but why? And have a conversation, but why not? You're sitting here being distracted, sitting there waiting for your next meeting in half an hour when you're not getting paid for lunch half an hour.
Yeah.
We need to be practicing what we say is important, which is our staff's, well-being and their mental state. And yet we're all sitting in this room, stuffy, waiting for our next thing and not doing it. I said, and actually what was really interesting is that by the end of that place, it was almost a given. And why is people sitting at their desk? Because we're only just practicing it. We're perseveringly doing it every day. And if I missed it, it would be like, why aren't you coming? Because actually being a leader is not about what status you are. It's about being seen to be leading a new thing. So, when you're leading a team, or if you're not leading a team, but by keeping to your boundaries, going, this is my break, this is what I'm looking after myself, having an act of doing something, it goes back to having the choice of behaviour, but bringing alongside other people, that's an interesting change of narrative, because it means that other people then get to practice, but they don't understand or go, oh, this is my tick for self-care. This is, oh, I'm having a good conversation, I'm getting some fresh air. This has actually benefited me and I'm in a better state and mood, and I've actually had a better afternoon because I'm not, I'm actually taking time out for myself.
Well, I worked for an organisation and we were lucky enough to have a new building to move into that was fitted out before the organisation was formed. And one of the early things that came in was we were not allowed to eat at our desk at all. There was a tiny little sort of refectory downstairs because, again, we were lucky to be based quite close to the town centre. But as senior managers, we were encouraged to go sort of walking the floor, as it were, and making sure that people didn't eat at their desk, that they took a break, and that was either downstairs in the refectory, where, as you say, they then had conversations with colleagues that perhaps they might not interact with on a sort of regular working day, but just to get those screen breaks and to have, albeit a relatively small space, but a space that was no longer about work. It was actually just about recharging your batteries and that sort of thing. But I do remember there was initially quite a lot of resistance to it because of this expectation to always be present, especially in a startup, and that you're showing your worth and value. But I think that was actually really innovative and forward-looking.
Yeah. Well, it reminded me of something, because the image that I use a lot actually is around, we're all in a society where we're addicted to our phones, right? And we need to have it charged all the time. So we wouldn't dream of going to bed without charging our phones or getting up to make sure our phone is charged. And the amount of information we use our phones for and all the interfaces that we have on there and how quickly it can start draining. We, as a society, we're always a bit anxious when we want a battery to run out. And so we always make sure that's charged. And that's exactly the same for our own self. If we are not charging ourselves up and we are not making sure that we are at all times as full as we can be to be able to give out to others and be able to do our jobs well and doing things, that's where the burnout and the stress and exhaustion comes in, because we're not charging our own batteries, and yet we'll charge our own phones. That's not even human, right? But we neglect our own selves because there's this sense that everything else comes first, that we need to do this job. But until we start flipping that narrative the other way around, it's not about being selfish or what's the word? You're, floating your own ego, or whatever the term I'm thinking of. But it's actually a way of being a more productive human being you're a better leader by it, and people get the best out of you. You know, even as a mum, if I'm not looking after myself, I can guarantee I'm going to have a rubbish day because everything else suffers. Everyone else suffers.
Yeah.
And so actually I need to prioritize that in order for them to have the best out of me. And the same in the workplace. You know, my clients don't get any good out of me if I'm not fully present.
Yeah.
I can't be fully present if I'm not taking time out between sessions, or I'm not taking care of myself, or I'm not having supervision to be able to check in that I'm doing the right things. You know, we all need recharging.
I heard a good expression that you sort of reminded me of the other day, and it was about sort of reframing how we look at time management and considering it actually as choice management. So time management, I think, has become a very sort of heavy concept and is often introduced almost like as a penalty for somebody who is perceived not to have a good performance in the workplace. So if they're being put on remedial performance management practices and an improvement plan and those kinds of things, they're often sent on a time management course to manage your time better. Or to your point earlier about time invested in self-management is actually more productive. If you look at something about I'm taking a choice to have a 15-minute walk around the block between meetings, or I make a choice to ensure that all of my meetings are 45 minutes long, that I'm making a choice to set boundaries, that's actually more empowering than sometimes the negativity of an expectation of good time management. And another one that I heard was you're advocating for yourself. And if you're advocating for self-care as a leader and demonstrating the authenticity and the congruence of self-care by your own behaviours and the way you manage yourself, then actually when you're telling your team, who we invariably care a lot about, when you're advocating that with your team, they can see that there is a congruence between what you're saying and what you are choosing to do as an individual.
And I think what's really interesting is the world of work in the way that has changed significantly. So not just because of COVID, but even way back when, you know, people expected to go to work, not complain, do your job, go home, do your next duty. Whereas now the employer is a bit more as an employee, or that we have to look after our employees, their well-being, the way that they are outside, not just about their performance, but who they are as a human being is just as important, because the research states and shows how much of, you know, how we show up to work shows how much productivity we can be.
Yeah.
And it's not just about the 9 to 5, because you know, that's why some countries are going down to the 4 days, because actually if you are giving people the rest they need and you're given to have that life balance, they're more productive. They're able to give more. They're able to engage more. And even with the way that, you know, when I worked with in the NHS during COVID, and what was really interesting is how much emphasis then was around your stress, your self-care, how are you going to, you know, decompress from the day, how are we going to talk about the impact of your work, how are we going to put skills, how are we going to ensure that people are not just talking about it but actively doing it. Whereas I think there is a tendency to have a knowledge of but then not actively practicing every day, and I think that can be the danger of ignoring self-care.
But that then goes back to your 3 Ps, and particularly perseverance, because what I'm taking away from what you just said is that we were great encouraging and prioritizing self-care during COVID, and then once we started to get into a new type of normal, self-care stopped being the, you know, as much as a focus and the discussion points and things like that. And also I feel a lot of organisations in that broader wellbeing space now no longer see it as, not all obviously, but a lot of them no longer see it as a good business practice to follow, but more of a box to tick.
Yeah, I think that's a danger where we could easily be, is that, even advertising for a job now, you're talking about the benefits, right? You're talking about the benefits of being in this bed, the benefits that we can give you, and there'll be well-being in there somewhere.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it won't be about, we prioritize your self-care, or, that we recognize that your self-care has an impact to your performance, and therefore we provide this and this and this, or we ensure that this is happening. And I don't think that, I'm not sure if that'll ever change, but there is a danger of, we've talked about it enough, the research says enough, we've done our duty. But actually what is important is whether you're on a career path into leadership or not, as an individual, we are always being watched by those around us in our little world of influence, whether that's your children, whether that's your friends, whether that's anyone really that knows you. And actually, I've had so many interesting conversations when I've kept to my boundaries, and I need to say a season when I've needed to say no more than yes, or they've kind of witnessed me journaling or taking a break and just not needing people around me. And I'm an extrovert, so I need people, and I need to be connected to people. But there's different seasons because of different areas of stress levels or things that's happened in my life, and I've had to adapt what my self-care looks like. And that's been interesting, because you can, if we're not open-minded or understand, because we're always changing as humans as well. So depending your position at work, for example, there's different expectations. There's different people that you're leading. There's different seniority, even within your post, of how your interactions. But actually, it is a responsibility to bring that into the workplace. And I've always been quite open about saying, but what cost? So we're making a decision about a new strategy, for example, or a new way of working. And then it does get exhausting sometimes to be the one who kind of says, but have you thought about the impact of? Have you stopped to think about how we're going to support staff's thinking about it? How are we going to look after ourselves while we have to take this responsibility? And I don't know if we're generally very good at being able to have those conversations.
I think that's a really interesting point as well. And I know that you weave well-being and self-care and employee value into all of your ways of working. But I was just minded about, for example, organisational restructures, which have happened quite consistently in the time that I've been working, and are again coming to the fore, where there's a lot of sort of downsizing and restructuring and combining roles. And from an HR perspective, we will hold our hands up and sort of say, we need to be mindful about the impact of this on staff. But the reality that I see post a restructure is that it's done now, and off we go. And I think that the focus on employee well-being as a concept within an organisation, and self-care, and advocating for managers and leaders in particular to support their own self-care, has dropped down the agenda again. So we'll mention it at the beginning when we're doing a restructure. People will say that's a good idea. And then as the restructure gets underway, it starts to become deprioritized. And then when the restructure is finished, she says, doing in air quotes, then it's almost as if it didn't exist. We mentioned it X number of months ago, it's done. And it goes back to what I was saying about a tick box.
But also, I think we are the tick box around, for our employees, that's fine, but not for us as leaders.
Yes,
right?
yes.
And so the expectation is that we're like workhorses, that we've just got the energy all the time, we're able to do this all the time, we have all these hats all the time. And it goes back to that, actually, being also a neurodiverse person, I don't function the same way. I need to be creative. I need to be out of my downtime. I need to think outside the box. I need to be able to have processing time. And if I don't get that, then actually I'm not able to do all those things. And we are privileged, we're going a bit off topic, we are privileged in a world where we are talking more about ADHD, being dyslexic, talking about menopause, talking about the impact of life cycles in a workplace. But I'm still not seeing those languages as much around we'll use the word mental health. We won't talk about the self-care in your day. So we'll talk about lunch breaks and we'll tell you we've got this. And they'd sometimes do it in your IPRs. And I know when I'm working with clients, it's always, well, how do you look after yourself? What's working for you? And that's an interesting conversation because actually it's, well, I've no time. And it goes back to the choice element of going, this is something that can impact everything that you do. But that's a difficult challenge to be able to go, but it also means us. So if I'm supporting you, if I'm expecting you to be able to take that ownership of yourself and being a better employee or working on yourself, then I have to be mirroring that.
Yeah.
And I need to make sure that I'm not available at times. I need to make sure that I'm able to go out and have some space. I need to be able to go, whatever elements that work with you, that needs to be mirrored regardless of seniority. So although I agree, there's also that leadership element that still hasn't quite shifted yet. So we say the right things and we'll tick box and we'll talk about how important our staff is, but the stats still are the stats, and people are still going off work on stress.
I've seen people passed over for promotion because they've set boundaries, because they've set their working day, and they're not the kind of people who would leave their team in a crisis. You know, they're good people, they're hardworking, they are conscientious, but boundaries don't seem to be a valued characteristic.
Because it doesn't make money.
It doesn't make money. Yeah. So
If we're talking in black and white terms, this is why stats are so important. And research is backing all the science around self-care and self-regulation, because actually those boundaries are so critical in order to perform, but yet as a status quo, as an employee or employer, shall I say, it's still twisted in the fact that that's seen as a negative because they're rigid.
But then I guess the reverse is therefore true, that boundary setting does make money.
Absolutely.
Because you're going to get a return on the investment of setting boundaries and prioritizing self-care, because you have fewer people off sick, you have a more engaged workforce, you have a more productive workforce because they're not at the tipping edge of burnout. And because they're getting the proverbial work-life balance, they are more effective as employees.
But in the moment, the employer is seeing them as not a team player, not being able to perceive. So they're not seeing the long haul. They're just seeing in that moment. So whoever is your manager, your boss, your employer, it is a concern that they are performing well, but it's a perception thing of what we think working hard is. If we're not able to say, actually, you're a great example of being able to know your boundaries, because actually for an employer, they're not seeing that. But yet the stats don't lie that actually if we're putting those things in place, you will get a better employee. But I think there's still a long way to go for people to see if we're all enabled to do that.
Yeah.
Rather than wanting quick fixes, quick wins, and just be yes people.
You know, society has put a value on working hard and what they perceive working hard to be, and being that sort of team player and what have you. I probably haven't prefaced it properly, but it just made me think about some cultures, how some countries value hard work or see people's potential. And, you know, in certain Asian cultures, for example, there is an expectation that nobody in a department goes home before the boss goes home. And there, you know, the example that I recall was of a manager who would do the working day and then sit and read their newspaper at the end of the working day. And when they had finished reading the newspaper, they would, you know, fold it up and off they would go. And then all of the more junior staff could go home after that. But woe betide anyone who went off beforehand. And that has taken a long time, that cultural shift. And I don't know if it still goes on, but, you know, it's sort of deep rooted in what a commitment to a workplace looks like. And out of sight is out of mind.
Yeah, exactly. And I think obviously we've got a long way to go, but just being able to demonstrate I think so much research about the benefits of that is important. So yeah, I think I'll add probably in art underneath about some of the books and some of the things of research I'd recommend people to looking into. I'd be really interested to see what our listeners think about. I'd love to hear your stories about self-care in the workplace, whether it's talked about, if it's still something that's an issue. What stories have you had that have been really good? What's your techniques? What do you use? And yeah, I'd just love to hear your experience really about self-care in the workplace.
One of mine, just to sort of start with a tip that I've found that works. In my kitchen, we've got a staircase that comes off of the kitchen. There's a little step at the bottom. And I would come home at the end of the day and we'd sit and have a cup of tea, maybe a glass of wine or something like that occasionally. And I would just offload about the day. And at times it was almost like my husband would sort of say, "Oh my God, you're making my ears bleed." Just because I'd walk in and just, and it would all come out. But it was really quite cathartic. And then we would follow it up. We do follow it up with a rule that after 9 o'clock at night, we're not allowed to talk about various things: work, families, finances, holidays, all those sorts of key issues that can trigger the stress again and the anxiety, or get you out of that moment of unwinding. And
that's interesting to have. I think that having some kind of unspoken rule is really interesting. I would just, when the children were a bit younger, I'd have a certain time off electronics, 45-minute downtime, reading, doing whatever, anything that was away. And that's the same for me. I think sometimes life can vary around, but I think it's about the conscious awareness of going, okay, I need to have certain things that help. I always have a ritual that I try and do most days, is when I'm driving somewhere and going to work, is about noticing, okay, so where's my tension today? Is it in my shoulders? Is it in my neck? And just having a 2-minute of going, what do I need to do? And I've
like a body scan.
Yeah. So normally, like in drama therapist, I'm always moving or needing to stretch out, and your body holds the stress. So whether you've got trauma in your life, whether you've got chronic illness, whatever it is, your body holds a score. There's a great book about that actually. And it's all, your body holds that tension and that stress, and over time it can cause a lot of actual physical pain as well as physiological pain. And I always try and go, okay, is that to do with something that's coming up? And it's almost having a mini conversation with myself. So yes, you're doing your body scan, but it's like, what do I need to do? So what do I need to do today? I need to make sure, and almost put those little things of go, okay, they're the things I need to deal with after work, and put that and go, well, I'll do that later. And it's almost, I need to have, it sounds really weird saying it out loud, but it's a way of kind of doing your to-do list and leaving it in the car, but also noticing your own body. So, okay, I've got stretching stuff, so I need to make sure that I'm sitting better today, or I need to make sure that I'm aware of how I'm going to be in that breathe. I also need to remember to breathe. So actually, what breathing exercise do I need to do that? Okay, fine. At the end of the day, I'm going, oh, okay, where is it now? Recognizing the impact and almost having that time to process. And another thing I do in the car is often have audio books which are really empowering or encouraging or faith-based, that can swish my thinking into just inward looking, which then can switch my mindset, shall I say, into another way of seeing things, which is really helpful. Whilst it's the same, I suppose what you're saying is you doing the actual act of almost verbalizing it to something else, not even a word, is a process of putting it outside of your mind. And so for me, audibly talking, is just letting it all out, which is great, but also the physicalization of needing a stretch or being able to have a wiggle or, do something physical. It really helps me to switch that actual cognitive part of my brain. Otherwise, I'm too mentally exhausted and fried, and it's almost like I have pain at the front of my head because it's all cognitive thinking all day, and I haven't used my body, or I haven't used another part of myself, and my body's almost so tense that I need to do something, and I'm quite an expressive person. I use my hands a lot. I was brought up in France, everyone uses their hands, but I need that physicalization of expression.
Mm-hmm.
And in a world where often we can be a computer all day, and in meetings where we're using our cognitive brains, we're using just a tiny part of our actual selves. And so for me, recognizing that I need to go for a walk is not only taking self-care, but it's also helping my body move and connect and get away from my cognitive thinking.
So, from the types of things that we have discussed so far, what I'm picking up from you is as much as self-care is about boundaries, a lot of self-care is about self-recognition and being curious about yourself, why you're feeling or behaving in a particular way. But also a lot of the techniques to help facilitate self-care are actually short and small and, little tiny things that take 5 minutes, 10 minutes and don't cost any money.
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? It's misconceptions again. It goes back to people perceptions around what self-care is and what it isn't, and daily choices and practices. So you choose to get up in the morning, you choose to get dressed and go to the toilet, you choose to go and brush your teeth, you choose to self-care, but we choose to just push through that and just go, well, we're going to, because self-care can be an active, a bit like mindfulness. Anything could be mindfulness if you're actively in the present moment of it.
Yeah.
Eating, it could be a mindfulness act. Brushing your hair can be a mindfulness act, but we don't cognitively connect that. We're just rushing through the practice of it. But it's acknowledging that there's too much of a cost to your life by not self-caring.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not just a financial cost to the employer and your productivity, but actually to your health and to the way that you see yourself. And the perception of either being selfish, or I'm not worthy enough, or it's not in my culture, that's also a danger in itself. Because actually, unless we start shifting that and thinking actually without doing self-care in a daily practice, it's almost like a vicious circle because we're not able to do the things that we think is important. So putting your gas mask on, recognizing is the first instant, recognizing how important self-care is, recognizing that you are worthy enough, that everyone around you is better when you self-care. Your productivity, the way that you're able to perform, the way that you are able to present yourself, everything is better when you're able to practice, prioritize and persevere.
I think that's brilliant.
Okay. Thanks, guys. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time. Thanks for joining us today on Heels in the Hierarchy with SJ
and Pegsy. If you've enjoyed today's episode, please spread the word and share it with your work bestie, your mentor, or anyone with their heels in the hierarchy.
Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and if you could spare a moment to leave us a review, it helps our other ambitious women find our community.
Find us on LinkedIn and Instagram for more content and behind-the-scenes glimpses.
Until next time, keep your heels high and your standards higher.